Well, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. And the real focus of today's meeting is about R&D. And so I was asked to talk about the paradigm shift in R&D from my perspective of 20-plus years in pharma and now in the CRO space, and talk about what the future outlook means and what changes are really driving the new paradigm. But before we do that, I'm going to do something I've never done before, and I'm going to share a video with you. And so if we can cue that video up, then I'll explain it after you look at it. Thank you. Okay, so first, thanks to many of you in the audience who have contributed to bringing some of those vaccines to individuals around the world, and for those of you in the audience, which are all of you, who are working very hard to realize some of the dreams of eradicating certain diseases which were mentioned. As we think about the paradigm shift for R&D, I'm going to talk about three topics today. I'm going to look at how we're strengthening the capacity of R&D in our organizations, and more importantly, looking at how collaboration is driving that. Diversity is a key component of innovation, and I think companies have all realized that working together is a much better way forward than being more individualistic. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the new technologies that are on the forefront of changing the way in which we do R&D, and more importantly, driving greater success. So let's talk about this paradigm shift, because I think we're at a very interesting stage in modern drug discovery. If you look at the first generation, it was really built around serendipity and the use of natural products. And certainly great medicines came from this and helped to increase life expectancy, but they just began to scratch the surface. As we moved into the second generation, the emergence of medicinal chemistry, of combinatorial chemistry, of biological drugs such as monoclonal antibodies, peptides, and proteins, and very, very high throughput technologies really enhanced the productivity. But the challenge was that the productivity didn't match success in getting to the market and getting important medicines to patients. And the reason for that was because during this time, in my feeling, there was a significant reduction in investment in understanding the biology of human diseases. It was believed that the actual drugs themselves would be the tools that would allow one to validate a target as being relevant to human disease. And that model just frankly did not work. What happened next, though, is quite interesting. We're now 10 plus years into having the sequence of the human genome, as well as many other genomes, and comparative genomics and genetics are now educating us more and more about the molecular basis of human diseases. And it's this molecular understanding built upon the foundation of the technological advances that were made that are really going to drive this next wave of innovation. And one can now start to think about drugs that will drive prevention, as many vaccines do, reclassifying certain diseases from terminal to ones that can be treated and one can live with a relatively good lifestyle as chronic, and finally even thinking about cures as we get into therapeutic vaccines and combination therapies. And again, all being driven on the back of our better understanding of the molecular understanding of the diseases that are being pursued on top of really wonderful therapeutic modalities. So let's talk about those therapeutic modalities for a second, and let's think about what is the next step that's going to either keep those therapeutic modalities going into that next generation or really put them back where natural products were. So if you look at small molecules, and we'll focus first on the validated modalities, and small molecule drugs certainly remain a mainstay, but the real challenge here is diversity. And it's not just diversity for the sake of numbers, it's the right type of chemical diversity that will drive greater potency and selectivity. And finally, it's really going to have to be built upon a foundation of better disease understanding and the selection of drug targets. The value creation here is chronic treatment at a high cost. If you look at biologics, and let's focus this on monoclonal antibodies and proteins, here you're looking at diversity as well, but it's diversity in terms of delivery. It's diversity in terms of being able to use this platform to now interrogate targets that reside within inside the cell, and again, focusing on the disease biology. The outcome is similar to that of small molecules in that the value creation will be chronic treatment at a high cost. If we look at vaccines, and let's focus on prophylactic vaccines, diversity is really going to come in the form of targets, durability, and finally delivery. And I think delivery is a major area of focus right now as we think about a more flat world and the global needs. The beauty here, though, is that the value creation is prevention at a relatively low cost. And so you can see that the opportunity space for vaccines, particularly prophylactic, is quite high. If you look at emerging modalities, still a lot of work to be done, but still quite a lot of interest. We look at stem cells, which come in many flavors. So you can look at iPS cells for tissue regeneration. You can look at mesenchymal stem cells for immune modulation. And those offer great promise for addressing a number of diseases. RNA-based therapeutics, where now you can have essentially one drug that can address every transcribed gene in the human genome, but the challenge of delivery, targeted delivery, and bioavailability in the cytoplasm really remain high hurdles. And then finally, therapeutic vaccines, and certainly Provenge has made it to the market, but there's still many, many challenges associated with therapeutic vaccines, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The beauty of these emerging technologies is they offer the promise of prevention and cures. Now, if we look within the vaccine space, you heard yesterday that there are more than 80 companies in vaccine R&D, and there's good news and bad news associated with that. For those players, the big players who are well-financed, certainly the good news is that they have the financial wherewithal to follow the science and to bring those important vaccines to the market. For the smaller, new biotech companies, while there is money out there, the amount of money that they're getting is not sufficient. It's really violating their whole business model, and more importantly, forcing them to make shortcuts in their science. And in dealing with therapeutic vaccines, which are such complex entities, the science really has to rule. And so I think there's still a lot more work that's going to have to be done, and hopefully some of these companies will start getting support from the large pharma companies to give them the financial breadth that they need to really develop their science. We're looking also at an expanding market for prophylactic vaccines into developing markets, which is not surprising. On the therapeutic side, again, looking at biological and targeted oncology vaccines, Certainly the approval of Provenge is an important event, but let's not forget that today there are 250 clinical trials, more than 250 clinical trials going on for cancer vaccines. And which are going to win and which are going to lose, I think, is anyone's guess, but still it's early days for this technology. If you look at the influenza side, it becomes a little bit more interesting. 19 companies working in the influenza virus space, vaccine space, and 138 trials going on right now. And you wonder, what is the real innovation that's driving differentiation? Or is it just going to splinter the market? And then finally, on the upside, new technologies. And I've just listed a few here, like virusomes and others, that really are making a difference in the way vaccines are being developed and ultimately will be delivered to individuals around the world. Again, if you look at the balance between prophylactic and therapeutic vaccines in terms of clinical trials, it's about 2-to-1 prophylactic to therapeutic. But you start to see something emerge that tells you that it's a very, very different ballgame. On the prophylactic side, success rate is relatively high, certainly much higher than what's seen for biologics and small molecules. But if you look at the therapeutic vaccines, you're seeing a very different picture. Because here, these types of vaccines are far more complex, multi-component, have delivery issues, have other types of issues associated with it, but more importantly, have to beat the current standard of care for many of the diseases that are shown. And if you look at these diseases, you see cancer, HIV, Alzheimer's, addiction, and many, many more that are being pursued. So great promise, but many questions and a lot of testing that will have to be done in humans to really understand what's driving the biological outcomes. If we look at it from a market perspective, as you heard yesterday as well from Henrietta, there's enormous growth in vaccine uptake in the world, and projected growth of more than 10% annually. And just in 2014, annual sales predicted to be $35 billion, which actually could be an understatement, pending the success of some of the trials that are ongoing today. And you're also seeing a difference in the patient or the individual that's being exposed to vaccines, from pediatric to also now more and more of the adult area. And all of this is being driven by the innovative products that have been brought to patients, as shown in the box on the bottom right. Now, with all that great news, there's the reality of the environment that we're living in. And obviously, pharma is under enormous stress due to the losses from patent expiration of many of the drugs that came out of the second generation of drug discovery. And you can see close to $25 billion in lost revenues this year, and close to $20 billion in 2012. And in the next 5 years, close to $140 billion in lost revenues. Now, the upside of this is that new drugs are coming to the market and will certainly help to fill that gap, but they're not the full answer. And what you're seeing is pharmaceutical companies taking two approaches. One approach to deal with this lost revenue is to diversify, to say, well, yes, we're going to continue doing pharmaceutical R&D, but we're going to get into generics, we're going to get into medical devices over the counter, and that's fine. And then you're seeing others that are remaining true to their pharma R&D objectives and moving forward, albeit on perhaps a smaller budget. But the reality is quite different. If you look at the total investment in R&D, what you're just seeing is a shift. If you look at the blue line, that represents the R&D budgets, and it's a little dated, from those companies that are a member of the pharma organization. And you see that going down, and that just goes to 2009. But if you look at all companies that are conducting R&D, you see that the total investment is actually going up. And $65 billion in 2009 is still quite a bit of money, and quite enough money to get a lot of good work done. And then we also talk about how the world is getting flat, but the world is changing, and as R&D experts, we have to respond to those changes. About 12 years ago, I began my journey in China. And when I first got there, we had the idea that perhaps we would start to develop R&D expertise in diseases which were more prevalent in that country. So we began working on HPV, liver cancer, nasopharyngeal cancer, just to name a few. But it didn't take long to see that the booming economic situation in China was leading to dramatic lifestyle changes. And what began to happen, as you all know today, is many of the diseases associated with lifestyle changes are now emerging. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, COPD, etc. But what's interesting is the opportunity to still consider China from an R&D perspective is still important because those diseases are on top of a very different genetic background. And so they're not the same necessarily as the diseases seen in the West. And that still represents an opportunity, but it just tells you how rapidly things can change in terms of your perspective of R&D. And then on the other side of the equation, we have those countries which aren't as fortunate and are not developing as rapidly, where about 1 billion individuals around the world are really not getting the health care that they need. And to the credit of many companies that are in this room, they're stepping up and they're trying to find ways to invest their money to bring important vaccines to help these individuals around the world. But what's particularly interesting about the approach is that it's far more collaborative than it was. So you see public and private working very well together now to start to bring this together, and even the NIH through the new committees that have formed for treatment of rare and neglected diseases. And so the paradigm shift is a bit complicated. It's driven by a world that's getting flatter. It's driven by a world where the types of diseases that each of us have to think about on a daily basis and try to think about solutions for is changing. It's a changing world where we have available the know-how, the technologies, and insights into the human genome to really pick the best targets. And so the paradigm shift, in my opinion, is unbelievably positive. But no one company can do it all, and collaboration is the key. If you look at the players, they're changing. We have pharma, which certainly has the largest investment in R&D and the broadest capabilities and know-how. We have biotech, which currently, as I mentioned, is budget constrained, but highly focused, and in many cases virtual. The days of hiring your 20 chemists or biologists are over. Most of these companies, if they have 10 or 15 people, that's pretty high. And then we have government, academia, and nonprofits, where actually budgets are growing, and the focus is changing as well. And I'll get into that in a moment. And then finally, we have CROs, where the whole model for CROs is also changing, and I'll describe what that means in detail in a moment. But if you look at those two inverted pyramids, basic research done in the public sector was always the driver for selecting targets within the private sector for drug discovery. If you look at basic research, the significant NIH budget, hopefully going up this year, we'll see, but you can see the complementarity of the approach within the public and the private sectors. The biggest challenge that we face today is that both of these sectors are trying to reinvent themselves, where the public sector is now thinking that they can do R&D perhaps better than pharma, and pharma is thinking perhaps they can do basic research better than what's seen in the public sector. And the hope is that there can be a happy medium, and we can find ways to work together to get the best out of both. But the bottom line, it's going to take collaboration. And let's look at the CRO market that I spoke about just briefly. You're seeing CROs that are now developing full integrated capabilities and know-how that span the value chain, and have the capabilities to start with a target and go all the way to the market. Well, why is that? Well, it's because of the huge influx of talents into the CROs due to the changes that are going on in the pharma and the biotech sectors. And these individuals have sufficient experience to understand where there are opportunities to make changes across that R&D value chain, and are leading to investments in differentiated and innovative platforms that can now be offered back to the pharma, academic, and biotech communities. And so if you look at it, say, from a food chain perspective, with pharma at the top, biotech, and then CRO, you're seeing an evolution of the CRO to a more biotech-like organizations that have not only commodity-based services to offer, but intellectual know-how and technologies that are differentiating. And what it means is that the whole relationship of a client-customer is evolving to that of a partner, where capabilities are existing, but making more strategic investments to bring game-changing types of capacity in, and technologies that really offer paradigm shifts and different ways of doing drug discovery and development. And it makes sense, because if you look at the growth of outsourcing, it's very dramatic. And actually, it's going faster than the numbers on this slide actually show. 12.5% compound annual growth in global outsourcing. And if you look at the table at the bottom, you can see that such areas as global lab services are now fully outsourced, and others at the 50% and rising. But the biggest opportunity space is really in the discovery sciences. And that's where many of the companies are investing today. But clearly, virtualization of R&D has arrived, but has to occur as a partnership. So let me just close by talking about the next wave of innovation. And so I like to show this slide because it offers a lot of promise and a lot of ways of stimulating thought. If you look at stem cells, I talked about the therapeutic potential of stem cells, but stem cells also have enormous applications as research tools. So safety testing and looking at human cardiomyocytes or human hepatocytes, doing high content screening, using human neuronal cells derived from iPS cells, all wonderful technologies that will better translate from the benchtop to the clinic. Biomarkers, I'm not going to go into it, but I'm happy to say that most clinical trials that are being run today are incorporating the use of biomarkers that allow better selection of patients or better monitoring of disease response. On the chemistry side, chemistry is at a crossroad. Certainly computational chemistry and in silico chemistry is progressing, but we still have to really see whether DNA-based chemistry and biological chemistry, which offers different diversity, will open up the realm of targets that can be prosecuted by small molecules. RNAi I talked about earlier, and biologics, it's really an interesting situation to understand the full importance of the monoclonal antibody molecule itself, and where one can make somatic changes in that molecule to drive ADCC, CDC, and other types of effector functions that better enhance the efficacy of these molecules. And then finally, vaccines, getting into combinations, ease of delivery, durability of effect, safety issues as more and more vaccines are put into us, therapeutic vaccines and the biology associated with that, and the various combinations that are going to drive efficacy, and then the role of vaccines in emerging markets. And all of this is being driven by the enabling technologies that really began to be developed, as I said, in the second evolution of drug discovery. I'm sure many of you have seen this issue of Time magazine that was devoted to Facebook, and if Facebook were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world, with over 500 million users just behind China and India. And it didn't take a lot of time for individuals to think about, scientists to think about, how they could make use of this social network and develop models to do epidemiology, measuring flu and looking at the pattern of flu dissemination across the world and other types of contagious diseases. And it's really just the tip of the iceberg as we get into in silico approaches to understanding human diseases. And then finally, the cell phone. I mean, I was recently filling out a document, I think it was my Swiss tax return, and it had a line that asked for my home phone number, my business phone number, and my mobile number. Well, I have a home phone number, but I don't know it. I've never used it. I have a business number, but I had to get my business card out because I don't remember it. And I have a cell phone, which basically is everything. And if you look at the rest of the world, it's all about the cell phone. They skipped all of those other types of landline-based communications. And so you can begin to think about the potential of the cell phone, not as just a way of communicating, but a way of doing real-time monitoring of human health, as a way of actually administering therapies and monitoring the effectiveness of that therapy. And it's not unrealistic. There are companies out there that are working on that, and as all of you in R&D then need to think about, how is this going to change the way you're going to bring the future vaccines to patients and individuals around the world? And then finally, if I'm talking about R&D, I have to show the value chain, and I think we're all familiar with the value chain shown at the top of that slide, and the time, I think, is pretty clear how long it takes to get from beginning to end. This is a sort of presentation of thought by PricewaterhouseCoopers showing the future value chain for drug discovery R&D. And I have to say it's appealing because it's certainly shorter, but I also have to say I don't really understand it. And I don't understand it because I guess I'm still in the world of understanding that you have to follow this approach. That there are no shortcuts. The only shortcut, in my opinion, is not time, it's intellect. And getting to a phase 2 study where you establish your proof of concept and your proof of mechanism, your proof of developability, and you go into phase 3 where you have a 100% chance of success. That's really where the future of the pipeline is going to go. It's intriguing, and I think it also points to the idea that more and more work will be in silico, and that certainly could speed up the whole process, but nevertheless, I don't think that's going to happen by 2020. So, final slide, just to summarize. I think the science of medicine has never been stronger and continues to improve. We have better drug targets to work on. We have better technologies to prosecute those targets. And I think from what I showed you, much better diversity of approaches through collaboration. Large, complex organizations have their pluses and minuses. They have the capital and capabilities, but they have organizational alignment, efficiency, and speed issues, which thankfully, through some of the financial pressure that companies are feeling today, are starting to be addressed. I don't believe regulators, patients, and payers are the problem. Reality is, if you have a safe, innovative, and effective drug, it will do well in the market. And a key is really diversity. It's not so much innovation, it's really diversity, because no one organization can do it all. And really, success depends upon the combination of internal and external drug know-how and creativity and operational excellence. And it's the sum of those three that gives you the end product of an innovative medicine. And finally, prophylactic and therapeutic vaccines offer great promise, and really the burden is on everyone in this room to really make that deliver. So I thank you for your attention. I hope I made you think a little bit about what the future looks like, made you think a little bit about what you're doing today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if there's time. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Dr. Babiss? I have one for you, sir. Are you suggesting then that CRRs are going to become more involved in early technologies, even at the preclinical stage?
Yes. So I think that I think if you look at where we are, we have to differentiate ourselves as well. And I think, as I said, with the influx of pharma and biotech talent into our organizations, they understand where there can be improvements. And I think that there are technologies that can be brought in and made broadly accessible to a large number of individuals and a large number of companies, and that's really where you're going to derive the value from the technology. It's not going to be by having IP protection and preventing others from using it. The real development and the real enablement of any technology is broad access, and the terminal value from the use of that technology is going to come in the form of the IP protected drug. So the answer is yes. I think we will make those investments.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I wanted to challenge you a little more on the numbers. I'm Niranjan Sardesai with an overview of pharmaceuticals. So you mentioned that about $65 billion is being spent in total pharma R&D, and 45 is from Big Pharma. What does the breakdown look like for vaccine R&D vis-a-vis pharma R&D? And I guess the real question is, if vaccine R&D is underrepresented over there, is that what's driving greater collaborations for, for increased innovation, because funding as a whole is limited?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question, because I worked at two companies that at the time that I was with them, there was no interest in doing any vaccine work. And it wasn't for lack of trying to convince the CEOs of those companies to make the investment, but they never thought it would give a return on investment. It's almost similar to the HIV situation today, where some companies have gotten out of it because they feel they can't make a return on their investment. You know, vaccines are interesting, and it still surprises me that more companies in an area such as pharma, where there is usually follow the leader, there hasn't been that much follow the leader. And I think today's pharma companies, those that really don't have the infrastructure to do vaccine work, are certainly agreeable to saying, well, here's where we are focused, but we have a whole other world of small companies that we could partner with to do vaccine. And frankly, I don't think you can dabble. I think you have to either be serious about it or not do it. And the few examples that I've experienced where we tried to do vaccine work in the context of the two companies I worked in were another failure. And it wasn't a surprise because we didn't have the internal know-how to really do that work. And so I would say if you look at the investment within the top 5 pharma companies that are doing it, I think it's quite good. But as I said earlier, I think the tiers down are suffering because the cost of capital is so high that they just cannot develop a broad pipeline. They really get one shot, and if it doesn't work, they're gone. And that's just the nature of the way companies are being funded today.